Lewis Hamilton has gone quiet, and strangely enough, that might be one of the biggest clues to what was really happening inside Ferrari, because when a 7-time world champion struggles, you normally expect the noise to be deafening. Questions everywhere, pressure from the media, fans demanding answers, critics talking about age, motivation, confidence, even whether the move to Ferrari was a mistake. But Hamilton didn't give them much. Instead, during the most difficult season of his Formula One career, he largely kept his head down and carried on. And now with Hamilton looking like a completely different driver in 2026, a Ferrari insider has finally offered an explanation for what was happening behind the scenes. And here's the interesting part. It wasn't one dramatic breakthrough, one secret setup change, or some magical upgrade that suddenly transformed Lewis Hamilton. The real explanation is much more uncomfortable for the people who wrote him off in 2025. It may simply be that they were wrong about him. To understand why, you've got to go back to Hamilton's first season in Ferrari Red, because the numbers were brutal. No victories, no pole positions, no podiums, not even one top 3 finish across the entire season. Think about that for a second. This is Lewis Hamilton we're talking about. 7 world championships, 20 years at the very top of Formula One. A driver who had spent more than a decade at Mercedes becoming the benchmark everyone else was chasing. And then he arrives at Ferrari, one of the biggest teams in the history of the sport, and suddenly he can't even find the podium. That wasn't just a bad season, it was the kind of season that makes people start asking questions they would have considered ridiculous only a year earlier. Had Hamilton finally lost his edge? Was 41 simply too old for the demands of modern Formula One? Had Ferrari made a mistake? Or, perhaps most importantly, had Hamilton's driving style and Ferrari's car simply become a terrible match? The results alongside Charles Leclerc made the situation even harder to ignore. The gap between the two Ferrari drivers was enormous, with Leclerc beating Hamilton by a staggering margin in their direct qualifying and race battles. For the outside world, the easiest conclusion was obvious. Hamilton was struggling because Hamilton himself was struggling. But there was something interesting about the way Lewis responded. He didn't spend the season publicly blaming Ferrari. He didn't turn every disappointing weekend into an excuse. He didn't constantly point fingers at the engineers or complain that the team didn't understand him. He became quiet. And in Formula One, that kind of silence can be incredibly revealing. Because sometimes a driver talks when they're trying to control the narrative. Other times, they stop talking because they know the real problem is much more complicated than anything they can explain in a post-race interview. Hamilton was entering an entirely new world. Remember, he had spent 13 years at Mercedes, 13 years learning exactly how that organization worked, 13 years building relationships with engineers, 13 years developing a car philosophy around his feedback, his preferences, his instincts, and his understanding of what the car needed. Then suddenly he had to start again. Different engineers, different procedures, different communication, different car philosophy, different expectations. And, of course, a teammate in Charles Leclerc, who had already spent years becoming deeply integrated into Ferrari's system. That's a massive reset for any driver. For someone who had been so deeply embedded in one team for so long, it was almost like being dropped into a completely different language and being expected to speak it fluently on day one. And that's where 2026 changed the entire conversation. Formula One introduced a dramatically different technical era. The cars became smaller and lighter. The balance between combustion power and electrical power changed, and suddenly the characteristics of the machinery were different. Almost immediately, Hamilton started looking more like himself. 4th in Australia, 3rd in China, then Ferrari's first double podium of the season at Silverstone. And eventually, the moment Ferrari fans had been waiting for, Hamilton winning in Barcelona, his first Grand Prix victory in Ferrari Red. And that victory came after 686 days without winning a Grand Prix. 686 days. That's nearly 2 full years of hearing the same question over and over again. Has Lewis Hamilton finally lost the ability to win at this level? Now suddenly, the same driver who couldn't reach a podium the year before was standing on the top step again. So what changed? Was Ferrari's 2026 car simply that much better? Did Hamilton suddenly rediscover something he'd lost? Or was there another explanation hiding underneath all those headlines? This is where the story gets really interesting because someone from inside Ferrari finally started connecting the dots. And if you've been following Formula One news closely, you already know that the biggest changes in Formula One rarely happen with fireworks. They're usually hidden in the details. A driver getting more comfortable with the brakes. An engineer finally understanding exactly what the driver means when he says the front end doesn't feel right. A steering system being adjusted by the smallest amount. A driver changing the way he approaches a corner because he finally trusts what the car is going to do underneath him. Those things don't make spectacular headlines. But at this level, they can be the difference between fighting for 10th and fighting for a victory. And that's precisely what Ferrari insider Marc Genet believes happened with Hamilton. Because according to Genet, this wasn't simply about Lewis getting better. It was about Lewis and Ferrari finally learning how to work together. And that distinction changes everything. Before we get into exactly what Genie revealed and why it could completely change the way you look at Hamilton's Ferrari journey, let me ask you something. Do you believe Hamilton's struggles in 2025 were mainly caused by the Ferrari itself? Or do you think Ferrari was genuinely exposing weaknesses in Hamilton that Mercedes had managed to hide? Because depending on your answer, this comeback tells a very different story. And the next part is where Ferrari's explanation gets surprisingly specific. Marc Genet's explanation of Hamilton's turnaround is fascinating because it doesn't point to one giant breakthrough. There was no single moment when Ferrari suddenly discovered some secret setting and unlocked 7-time world champion mode again. Instead, Genet describes something much more difficult and, frankly, much more important. Hamilton and Ferrari finally learned each other. That sounds simple until you understand how precise Formula One has become. At this level, the car feels bad isn't enough. A driver might feel that the front axle isn't responding quickly enough on entry, that the rear is moving in a way that makes him hesitate on throttle, or that the brake pedal doesn't give him the exact feedback he needs to attack a corner. Those differences can be tiny on paper, but inside a Formula One car traveling at enormous speed, tiny differences become everything. And according to Genet, one of the biggest changes was that the Ferrari of 2026 simply suits Hamilton's driving style much better than the car he had in 2025. That is a crucial distinction. Hamilton didn't suddenly forget how to drive in 2025 and then remember again in 2026. The machinery finally started rewarding the things he naturally does well. Gene specifically pointed to details such as the feel of the power steering and the response of the brakes. To a casual viewer, that might sound almost laughably minor. But imagine trying to hit the same braking point lap after lap while traveling at more than 300 kilometers per hour. And then imagine that the feedback through your hands and feet doesn't quite match what your brain expects. You can still be incredibly talented. You can still know exactly where the apex is. You can still understand how to manage the tires. But you're fighting the communication between yourself and the machine. That's the part fans usually can't see. They see the lap time. They see Hamilton finish behind Leclerc. They see Verstappen or another rival gaining several tenths. Then they decide the driver must have lost something. But the reality can be completely different. Sometimes the driver isn't slower. Sometimes the driver simply isn't comfortable enough to use the car's limits. And that's why Jenny's choice of words matters so much. He described the adaptation between Hamilton and Ferrari as mutual. Not Hamilton adapting to Ferrari. Ferrari adapting to Hamilton too. That changes the entire story. Because moving from Mercedes to Ferrari wasn't just a matter of Hamilton learning a new steering wheel or memorizing where the buttons were. Ferrari had to learn the driver as well. How does Hamilton want the brake pedal to load? How much rotation does he need from the front? How does he want the rear axle to behave under throttle? What kind of steering response gives him confidence? Where can the engineers give him more freedom to attack? Those aren't things you fully learn from a spreadsheet. You discover them through hundreds of laps, thousands of conversations, and countless tiny adjustments. And that's why Hamilton's first year at Ferrari may have been far more valuable than the results suggested. From the outside, 2025 looked like a disaster. Inside the garage, it may have been a long and painful learning process. That's an important difference. You can think of it like joining a new sports team after spending more than a decade with your old one. You may still be the same. athlete, but the timing of everything changes. Your teammates move differently. Your coaches communicate differently. The equipment feels different. Even the smallest habits you've built over the years suddenly have to be reconsidered. Formula One magnifies that problem because there's nowhere to hide. Every qualifying session puts the comparison directly on a timing screen. Every race turns teammate performance into another headline. And every mistake becomes evidence for whichever narrative people already believe. For Hamilton, the narrative in 2025 was becoming increasingly harsh. Some people were already asking whether age had finally caught him. Others thought Ferrari had made a mistake by signing him. And some were convinced that Charles Leclerc's dominance proved that Hamilton was simply no longer capable of operating at the level he once did. Then the 2026 regulations arrived and complicated everything. Suddenly, the smaller and lighter cars appeared to bring some of Hamilton's natural strengths back into play. Two-time world champion Emerson Fittipaldi highlighted precisely that point, suggesting that the new generation machinery better rewards the kind of car control Hamilton has always possessed. And that makes sense when you look at Hamilton's career. His greatest performances have often involved remarkable adaptability, smoothness, tire management, and an ability to extract performance from situations where the car isn't necessarily perfect. But if the characteristics of the machinery prevent those strengths from being translated into lap time, talent alone can't fix it. You can't outdrive physics. That's one of the first things every fan eventually learns about Formula One. A driver can be brilliant and still be limited by the machine underneath him. And then there was another voice from Ferrari's world, Gerhard Berger. Berger's reaction to seeing Hamilton and Ferrari return to winning form was revealing because it recognized something that had been missing during the first season together. There was genuine happiness in seeing the partnership finally produce what everyone expected when the deal was announced. That's significant because we're no longer talking about one isolated opinion. We're hearing a consistent theme from people with serious experience around Ferrari and Formula One. The car fits Hamilton better. Hamilton understands Ferrari better. Ferrari understands Hamilton better. And the regulations have moved toward characteristics that reward some of Hamilton's strengths. When those pieces start lining up at the same time, the result can look like a driver has suddenly been reborn. But the technical explanation isn't the only thing that makes Hamilton's comeback interesting. There's also a quieter decision that tells you a lot about how he approached the problem. The simulator. For years, the Formula One simulator has become an incredibly sophisticated tool. Teams use it to prepare drivers for circuits, test setups, understand vehicle behavior, and gather information without putting a physical car on track. It sounds like the perfect solution, but Hamilton discovered something that a simulator can't always solve. It wasn't giving him the same sensations as the real Ferrari, and rather than simply continuing because that's what the process demanded, Hamilton stepped back from relying on it in the same way. He preferred real seat time, actual laps, actual feedback, actual physical sensations from the car. That's a subtle decision, but it's a revealing one. It tells you Hamilton wasn't simply waiting for Ferrari to fix him. He was actively trying to understand what his body was telling him. And sometimes that's the difference between chasing numbers and actually understanding a racing car. You can look at a simulator graph and see what the car is doing. But a world champion can sometimes feel something that a graph doesn't capture. That's especially important for Hamilton because his driving has always been built around feel. He needs to trust the front end. He needs to understand the brake pedal. He needs confidence when the car rotates. And when the simulator wasn't reproducing those sensations accurately enough, he adjusted his process. Interestingly, that approach didn't stay isolated to Hamilton. His teammate Charles Leclerc went on to win the British Grand Prix shortly afterward as Ferrari recorded its first double podium since Hamilton joined the team. And that brings us back to the bigger point. The transformation inside Ferrari wasn't just about adding performance to the car, it was about creating understanding. Hamilton had to understand the Ferrari. Ferrari had to understand Hamilton. And the engineers had to understand where the data stopped being useful and where the driver's physical feedback became more important. That's why the phrase mutual adjustment is probably the most important part of Jenny's entire explanation, because it destroys the simplest version of the 2025 story. The easy story was that Hamilton arrived at Ferrari, struggled, got beaten by Leclerc, and perhaps finally reached the limits of what he could do. The harder story is that Hamilton arrived at a completely unfamiliar environment, struggled because the relationship wasn't established yet, and then gradually built that relationship until the car began responding in ways he could exploit. And here's the uncomfortable part for everyone who wrote him off. The second story is supported by what we're seeing now. The results changed, the confidence changed, the competitiveness changed, and most importantly, Hamilton himself seems to have changed the way he talks about Ferrari. He's not spending his time looking backward. He's talking about the next upgrade. He's talking about closing performance gaps. He's talking about what Ferrari can still improve. That sounds like a driver who believes there's unfinished business. And there is. Hamilton has openly discussed Ferrari's straight-line speed deficit compared with Mercedes, describing a gap of roughly 3 to 4 tenths in that area during the first half of the season. But listen carefully to the implication. He's not saying Ferrari is already perfect. He's saying the team knows where it needs to improve. And that's a dangerous place for the rest of the grid, because a driver who's already winning while believing his team still has performance left to unlock is a completely different threat from a driver simply trying to survive. That's where this comeback stops being a feel-good story and starts becoming a warning. Hamilton may not have been rediscovering his old self. He may have been building a new version of himself inside Ferrari. And if that's true, then the most difficult part of this whole journey might already be behind him. The question now isn't whether Hamilton can adapt to Ferrari. The question is, what happens when Ferrari finally adapts completely to Hamilton? That may be the most important question of the entire Hamilton story right now, because we've spent so much time asking whether Lewis could adapt to Ferrari that we almost forgot to ask what Ferrari could become once it fully understands Lewis. And there's a big difference. When Hamilton arrived at Maranello, everyone knew he was bringing an enormous amount of experience. What nobody could guarantee was whether that experience would translate immediately into Ferrari's environment. Formula One doesn't work like a video game where you simply move a 7-time champion into another car and expect the same lap time to appear. The driver and the machine have to trust each other. The engineers have to trust the driver's feedback. The driver has to trust the engineer's solutions. And eventually, everyone has to reach the point where a driver can say, "This is what I need." And the team immediately understands what that means. That takes time. And for Hamilton, time was exactly what he didn't have. The moment he joined Ferrari, every poor result was magnified. Every qualifying session against Charles Leclerc became another comparison. Every radio message was analyzed. Every mistake became evidence for somebody's theory about why Hamilton had supposedly declined. That's the brutal reality of being Lewis Hamilton. He isn't allowed the luxury of an ordinary transition period. When you're a 7-time world champion, people don't watch you struggle and say, "Give him a year." They say, "Something is wrong." And perhaps that's exactly why Hamilton's silence during 2025 now looks so different. Maybe he understood something the rest of us couldn't see. Maybe he knew that trying to explain the problem publicly wouldn't solve it. Because what exactly was he supposed to say? "My new team's steering feedback isn't quite right for my driving style. My engineers and I haven't yet developed the same language. The simulator doesn't accurately reproduce the sensations I need." Those are real problems, but they're not exactly the kind of answers that satisfy a television audience demanding a dramatic explanation after a race. So Hamilton did something surprisingly disciplined. He kept working. And that's where the psychological side of this story becomes impossible to ignore. For more than a decade, Hamilton had been operating in an environment where his instincts were deeply understood. Mercedes knew him. Hamilton knew Mercedes. They had built an entire working relationship through years of victories, defeats, development battles, championship pressure, and technical changes. Then, almost overnight, Hamilton became the newcomer. Imagine what that does psychologically. You're no longer the driver everyone automatically understands. You're the new guy trying to convince an entire organization that your feedback is the right feedback. And you're doing it while the world watches. Every weekend becomes a test of whether you made the correct decision by leaving Mercedes. That's an enormous burden. So when people looked at Hamilton's quietness in 2025 and interpreted it as frustration or doubt, they may have missed another possibility. Maybe it was concentration. Maybe Hamilton knew the relationship wasn't ready yet. Maybe he understood that one bad season couldn't tell the whole story, and that's where the turnaround becomes more impressive than simply winning a race. Hamilton didn't just survive the criticism, he stayed long enough for the process to work. That's important because Formula One rewards patience far less often than it rewards speed. Everyone wants the immediate solution. Bring the upgrade, change the setup, find the 10th, win the race. But some problems can't be fixed over one weekend. You can't compress 13 years of experience with one team into 3 practice sessions. You can't build total trust between a driver and a new engineering group after a couple of races. And you certainly can't rebuild a driver's relationship with a completely different type of car overnight. It takes repetition, it takes mistakes, it takes uncomfortable conversations, and sometimes it takes an entire season. That may be the real value of 2025. Not the results, the lessons. Because now Hamilton appears to have a much clearer understanding of what he needs from Ferrari, and Ferrari has a much clearer understanding of how to give it to him. That changes the starting point for everything that comes next. Hamilton has also sounded noticeably more optimistic when discussing Ferrari's development direction. He's acknowledged that the team still has a straight line speed deficit compared with Mercedes, with the gap around 3 to 4 tenths during the first half of the season. But instead of treating that as evidence that Ferrari can compete, he has pointed toward the upgrades still coming. That's an important mentality shift. A driver who has lost faith starts looking for exits. A driver who believes the project is working starts looking for the next improvement. Hamilton's comments increasingly sound like the second one. He's talking about new parts. He's talking about performance. He's talking about closing the gap. He's talking about the future. That doesn't sound like a driver regretting the move to Ferrari. It sounds like a driver who believes the move is finally starting to make sense. And that's where things get particularly interesting for Verstappen and everyone else at the front. Because the worst possible scenario for Ferrari's rivals isn't a Hamilton who is barely competitive. They can handle that. The dangerous scenario is a Hamilton who understands the car, trusts the team, knows exactly what he wants from the setup, and still believes Ferrari has more performance available. That's a very different proposition. Think about what happens when a driver stops spending energy trying to understand the machinery and starts spending that energy trying to attack the limit. The difference can be enormous. Instead of asking, how do I make this car work? The driver can start asking, how much can I get out of this car? Those are completely different questions. And we've already seen glimpses of what that looks like in 2026. Hamilton has gone from being unable to find a podium in 2025 to winning in Barcelona. He's gone from being questioned relentlessly to becoming a genuine threat again. And perhaps most importantly, Ferrari no longer seems like an experiment. It seems like a partnership. That's a crucial word. Partnership. Because this isn't just Hamilton trying to survive his final years in Formula One. And it isn't Ferrari simply borrowing the reputation of a 7-time champion. Both sides have something to prove. Ferrari wants to show that it can give Hamilton a car capable of fighting at the very front. Hamilton wants to prove that the disappointing first season wasn't the real measure of what he can still do. And honestly, that creates a fascinating situation for the rest of the season. Because what happens if the next upgrades work? What happens if Ferrari closes that straight line deficit? What happens if Hamilton becomes even more comfortable with the car? What happens if the man who spent 2025 adapting to Ferrari enters the second half of the season with Ferrari finally adapting to him? That's when the comeback could become something much bigger. And there's another reason I wouldn't dismiss Hamilton just yet. The 2026 regulations have already shown that the competitive picture can change faster than people expect. One technical concept can suddenly make a driver's strength more valuable. A particular balance characteristic can completely change how confident a driver feels. A small aerodynamic improvement can alter tire behavior enough to transform a race weekend. So looking at Hamilton's current form and assuming we've already seen his ceiling would be a mistake. We don't know the ceiling yet. Maybe Barcelona was the peak. Or maybe Barcelona was the beginning. That's the question. Because the most interesting interpretation of Hamilton's comeback isn't that a 41-year-old driver somehow turned back the clock. It's that he may never have needed to turn the clock back at all. Maybe he simply needed the right environment. Maybe the version of Hamilton that Ferrari fans were waiting for wasn't hiding somewhere inside the old Mercedes driver. Maybe that version had to be built. New team, new regulations, new relationship with the engineers, new understanding of the car, new understanding of himself. And that makes the criticism from 2025 look a lot less convincing in hindsight. The next time you hear somebody say, Hamilton was finished, remember how quickly that narrative collapsed once the car and driver finally started speaking the same language. That's the lesson here. Formula One isn't always about finding the fastest driver. It's about finding the combination where the driver can actually express everything he has. And right now, Hamilton appears much closer to that combination than he was 12 months ago. So let me throw the question back to you. Was Hamilton's 2025 season actually a warning sign that his career was fading? Or was it simply the price of starting over at Ferrari? And now that the team seems to understand him better, do you think we've already seen the best of his Ferrari comeback? Or could there be another level waiting in the second half of the season? And here's the really interesting one. If Ferrari finally gives Hamilton the car he wants, how much trouble could that create for the likes of Verstappen and the other championship contenders? Put your answer in the comments. Don't just pick a side, tell me why. And while you're there, support the channel by hitting the like button and sharing this video with another Formula One fan who has been following Hamilton's Ferrari journey. We're pushing toward 4,000 subscribers, and every subscription genuinely helps us get closer to that goal. Make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications because this Formula One news story is nowhere near finished. Hamilton spent 2025 trying to understand Ferrari. In 2026, Ferrari appears to be finally understanding Hamilton. Now we're about to find out what happens when those two things fully come together.